Hello. So this video is going to be a performance review of Moises Kaufman's play Gross Indecency, The Three Trials of Oscar Wilde, performed via Zoom by the University of Idaho Theater Department. So a little bit about the play. The performance that I saw was directed by Ricky Kimball. A little bit about the play. Kaufman's play is, like so many of Kaufman's work, a documentary play where he draws from a lot of different textual sources about the three trials that Oscar Wilde went through in 1895. My cat is screaming outside the door. I don't know if the mic is picking that up, but I apologize if it is. So, Oscar Wilde was had a relationship, a sexual relationship. Almost certainly, there is still some disagreement, but he had a relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, who was the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. Queensberry was not pleased with this relationship, and so he ended up leaving a card at Oscar Wilde's club that said, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." And he spelled sodomite wrong, which is an interesting thing in itself. But Wilde, at Douglas's prodding, brought a lawsuit for libel against Queensberry. Now, the problem with a lawsuit for libel is that in order to prove that something is libel, you need to prove that it is not true, which is difficult when it is true, or almost certainly is true. And actually, one of the things that's interesting, whether or not Queensberry was sort of clever enough to work this out for himself, or just happened to luck into this, because Queensberry wrote posing sodomite rather than sodomite. I'll pronounce it right rather than the way that he misspelled it. Because he put the word posing in there, all that the defense had to do essentially was to prove that it looked like Wilde was gay. Not that he had ever actually had sex with anyone. They never had to prove that he had engaged in same-sex sexual acts. They just had to prove that the signals were there. That it looked like Wilde was gay. And at some point, in that first trial, where Wilde sued Queensberry for libel, they were going to bring in a bunch of witnesses who probably were paid for their testimony, though it's entirely possible that they weren't 100% lying anyway. But they were going to bring in a bunch of witnesses who were going to swear that Wilde had sex with them. Male witnesses who were going to swear that Wilde had sex with them. And so before that could happen, Wilde's attorney, Edward Clark, withdrew the case. The problem was that at that point the Crown stepped in and said, we do have enough evidence that we can go after Wilde for gross indecency, basically for having sex with other men. And so they did. So they had the first trial for gross indecency, which basically ruined Wilde's reputation and ruined him financially. So he had two plays running in the West End at the time. Both of them were canceled. So he lost the bulk of his income. All of his creditors sort of came at the same time to cash in the debts that he owed, which ruined him financially. He was broke. His reputation was in tatters because it was assumed that he was guilty, whether or not, regardless of what the trial itself actually found. That being said, the first trial, they had a hung jury. The jury was unable to come to a verdict. So in the second trial for gross indecency, the Crown went further. It seems from the documentary evidence like there was a lot of underhanded stuff that the Crown did to make their case, because they were primarily concerned with convicting Wilde rather than necessarily finding out the truth. So this is what happens in the third trial, is basically all of the evidence has gone back over and Wilde is convicted and he's sentenced to 2 years hard labor. Now, as is fairly typical with Kaufman's approach to content in documentary plays, this is a bunch of different pieces from different texts woven together. So the main text that Kaufman draws on is the transcripts of these trials, but he also blends pieces of Douglas's later memoirs. He blends in pieces of different newspaper reports at the time about the trial. He blends in pieces of newspaper reviews of Wilde's work, and even pieces of Wilde's work itself. Sections from De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Jail and things like this. So it's all sort of threaded in here to create a kind of impressionistic view of these trials. And we see the same kind of thing with something like the Laramie Project, where we get different voices creating an overall impression. That's essentially what gross indecency does as well. Now, because of that, the play actually lends itself surprisingly well to a medium like Zoom, because in Kimball's production, we could have different characters popping in and out of the Zoom screen. So at some points, we'd have just one actor on screen. Luke Holt or Angel Kalish. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name right, Angel, but you did fantastic. So we'd have just one actor on the screen, but then at other times we'd have 3, 4, 5, 8, whatever it is. And so because we got that sort of flexibility, it actually worked really well for a play like this, which draws together a bunch of fragments and sort of threads them into one thing. The performances themselves were really, really good. Especially by the two sort of main characters, Luke Holt, who played Oscar Wilde, and Angel Kalish, who played Lord Alfred Douglas. These are both complicated characters, and actually in the post-show talkback, both actors talked about their process for creating the characters. So for Luke, one of the challenges was that Wilde he's big. He's larger than life. He's this sort of amazing character, and the challenge of bringing to life such an amazing real person was something that Luke talked about as being one of the struggles with creating the character. But we get that style, that panache that Wilde was so famous for in Luke's performance. So we get that wit, we get that sort of not dismissiveness, but casualness. This sort of, I don't know. I just want to it's this gesture. And I don't know if that's meaningful to you or not, but like this casual self-confidence in his own wit, his own artistry, his own ability to create. I think Luke really brought that to the fore. And then Angel, I'd actually asked about this through the chat feature, because Lord Alfred Douglas is such a complex character. He, at points, is clearly devoted to Oscar and wants him to win, wants him to be exonerated, but at the same time, so much of what Douglas does is detrimental to Wilde's case. And apparently, actually, later in life, Douglas was a Nazi supporter, so fuck him for that. Angel said that as part of his answer, that Douglas had been a Nazi supporter later on. But he's such a difficult character because, on the one hand, he is progressive and loving of Wilde. He believes and asserts in his memoirs that Wilde should have been honest about being gay, and that they should have fought for the legitimacy of that in 1895. On the other hand, he's so dedicated to trying to destroy his father, Queensberry, that he ends up pushing Wilde into this trial that he can't win, that ultimately ends up with Wilde being imprisoned. So we've got these two competing impressions of Lord Douglas, and Angel did a fantastic job creating those dichotomies. It's a really fascinating performance to watch. The rest of the cast was extremely strong, and that's great, because so often more minor characters or people who are doubling multiple characters end up being not great, but in this case they were strong. The two minor critiques I have of the performance, one is a lot of fake beards, mustaches, and mutton chops, which looked like fake beards, mustaches, and mutton chops, which was not great. The other was that some of the British and Irish accents were not excellent, and because they weren't excellent, they sometimes made it very hard to understand what actors were saying, particularly through Zoom, which depends on computer microphones. So there was that. It wasn't necessarily fantastic at all moments. But overall, it was an extremely good performance. It was an extremely interesting play. And unlike a lot of other plays, it lent itself well to Zoom as a medium.